Hi, it's Training Tip Tuesday. So today we're going to talk about clear communication between owners and dogs. And why do I feel this is a really important topic? Well, humans communicate very differently from dogs, and that can create a whole host of issues between us and our dogs. It creates frustration. It can also create some uncertainty. Both of those things can be problematic. So let's take a look at how dogs communicate first. Dogs communicate with 4 different types of signals. Their primary form of communication is body language. That's silent, but very, very effective. So in all of these pictures, we're seeing effective communication happening, saying different messages. In this first picture, this black dog here is uncomfortable with the space invasion of this other black dog. What you have here is eyes that are averted. The dog is tilting away from the other dog. We have a great big tongue flick. Its ears are back. And if we even look at this dog, it's turned away from this interaction, basically saying, I don't want any part of what's going on. If we look at the upper picture, what we see here is a gray dog trying to signal that it does not want any conflict with this red dog. Its head is lowered, its rear end is rounded, we've got a nice paw raise, and it's coming underneath the red dog. The red dog itself is turning away from the other dog. So these two are communicating that they're uncomfortable with the situation and nobody wants to escalate to a fight. If we look over here, what we see is a big dog communicating play gestures with this smaller Boston Terrier. He's leaning way far away from the direction of travel of this little Boston Terrier. We've got a nice paw raise. And so everything about this dog is soft, saying, hey, I just want to play with you, buddy. No worries. A dog's secondary form of communication is verbal. They bark, they whine, they growl. And when a client tells me that they want to stop their dog from barking, it's important to be educated that barking is just a communication tool, as is growling. So we don't want to suppress the dog's form of communication. It's a symptom of some other underlying emotion that the dog is feeling. This is a problem because humans use vocal communication as our primary form of communication. Then dogs use olfactory and tactile communication. So in this picture, what we see are 2 dogs that are sniffing each other. They may then proceed to each other's rear ends where there's a lot of olfactory scent communication happening. They will often touch very briefly in this area. There are scent pads in the cheek area of each dog. So we tend to see olfactory and tactile communication used in conjunction with other forms of communication signals. We've got a paw raise here. This dog's ears are tilted back. So those are body language cues from both dogs saying, hey, I'm just trying to get some more information on you. I'm just trying to introduce myself. Humans, unfortunately, communicate very inconsistently, or we often give mixed signals. So remember, our primary form of communication is verbal. Our secondary form of communication is tactile, through touch. We're a primate species, so we tend to use our hands a lot. That can be problematic from a dog's perspective. So let's take a look at human communication, especially as it relates to our dogs. We use hand signals. Whether or not we intend to do that, when we lure a dog through dog training, we often create a specific hand signal that is really prevalent when we're teaching sits and downs to dogs. Then our primary form of communication is our verbal communication. So we have words that mean specific behaviors, hopefully, to our dogs if we've done it right. Then we use tactile communication. So these two go kind of hand in hand, pun intended. We often will pet our dogs as a reward It's more reinforcing for humans than it is for dogs. And in this picture, this dog is really just tolerating petting. He's not really enjoying it. How do I know? Well, his eyes are closed, so he's squinting. His facial features are very tight. His ears are back, and he's actually sort of lowering his head. So these are all communication tools from the dog saying, hey, you know, I'm not really enjoying what you're doing to me. And olfactory stimuli comes in with the treats that we use. And so our dogs often will get into a bribe situation if we don't use our treats effectively as rewards. Well, consistency counts, and this is really the biggest message of today's Training Tip Tuesday. We need to be very, very consistent in what our cues say. If our verbal cues don't say the same thing as our hand signals, our dogs are going to get confused. And when our dogs get confused, unfortunately, it can lead to some problems and frustration both for humans and dogs. Here's two really good examples of this. If you use a flat open palm as a hand signal, in this situation, is this a signal to the dog or a cue to the dog to do a down? Is it a cue to do a wait, or is it a cue to do a stay? And how you have taught this to your dog is going to dictate whether they understand what you're trying to communicate. Another really good example of that is when we have our dogs on leash. Is this heel? Is this come? Or do you use some other word that means, hey, we're walking forward together? And let's talk about using the word come. I see a lot of clients that as they move forward, they say come, but then they also want the dog to do a recall when they say come, meaning go from point A to point B. And if that's the case, that's confusing for the dog. The word cannot mean two different behaviors. And that's a nice segue into, are you always using the same cues? So do you always use the same verbal cue for your dog? Do you always communicate the same with your hand signals or your body language? And are all of your friends and family members using the same cues? Because if they aren't, and you've got a dog who jumps like I do, I use the cue off so that my dog knows that they need to stay off of the human while I'm training him to sit for greetings. But if people use the cue down, that's confusing because down for my dog means lie down. And I haven't taught him to lie down from a jumping position. So that's confusing and conflicting for the dog. And if we look at this picture here, would you tell your dog off because they have their paws on the counter? Would you tell your dog leave it, meaning don't eat the chicken and French fries? Or would you say something else to the dog in this situation? And let's talk about the subject of leave it. Has your dog really been taught what each verbal cue that you use really means? So in reality, if you say leave it, does your dog understand that you want one specific thing? And what is it that you want from your dog? Do you want them to turn away from this? Do you want them to back away from it? Do you want them to make eye contact with you? Because if you haven't taught that to the dog, leave it probably isn't really understood by the dog because it needs to mean one specific thing. So let's recap what we've just talked about. Dogs read our body language first because that's their primary form of communication. Their verbal cues are very different from our verbal cues because speech is very normal for humans. And remember, verbal communication is secondary for dogs. Our verbal communication and our body language must say the same thing when we're working with our dogs. If we don't, it can be very confusing. Olfactory stimuli can get our dogs into trouble. We can also use it in the way that we use our food rewards. Tactile communication isn't always rewarding for the dog. So remember, how you touch your dog is going to dictate what communication they take away from that. Humans must use the same cues. This is really important for members of your household and anyone who interacts with the dog on a regular basis. And dogs must associate cues with one specific behavior, and only then can you help them generalize that to other contexts. So let me give you an example. This is Kanan. He just turned a year old. Nova Scotia duck-tolling retrievers are bred to go out and catch birds once they have lured them into closer to you if you're a hunter, and then you have taken care of the bird and they will run out and go pick it up for you. So he loves chasing birds and he loves chasing other critters. Well, I've taught him that when I whistle, it means come to me. And I've practiced that often, and I've rewarded him really well for it. Anytime I'm working on recall behaviors, I do not skimp on my rewards. And then we've practiced it in a variety of settings over the last 6 months. So now, because he has an association for what the whistle means, he's been reinforced for that behavior repeatedly. It's been practiced with a variety of different distractions and in a variety of different situations. So now I can use it when he is out of sight. So here's what it looks like.
Good job, yeah.
So even though he was out, looking at the birds that were flying away from the bird feeders, that whistle means come to me. And this is the important piece, is that it's communicating effectively exactly what I want. There's no confusion on Kanan's part. So watch for our 2-minute training tips. I'll do some more training tip Tuesdays in the future. And thanks for watching.